Welcome to Danny Finkelstein, prominent member of Northwood and Pinner Liberal Synagogue. He's the author of a new book, Everything in Moderation, which is published by William Collins. So I think we'll start first by asking Danny, why everything in moderation?
Well, first of all, let me just say thank you to you, Paul, for doing this. I know how busy you are putting out your paper and what an important community resource the Jewish Telegraph is. So I'm really grateful to you. The answer is that everything in moderation was a phrase that was really used by my mother to talk about crisps rather than about politics. And I've sort of appropriated it as the title. Look, it's partly a pun. The book consists of my columns over a period. So it's all the topics I'm interested in, but in small bits. They're 1,150 words each, so they're everything in moderation. But it also has a description of my politics, which is very much influenced by my parents' experiences, both by my mother's experience as a concentration camp survivor and my father's as a survivor of exile in Siberian winter of 1941. So this of 1940-41. So this is my attempt to address my political views across a wide range of topics, everything, and you will find a consistent theme, which is moderation.
Well, you've written dozens of columns. Who actually chose this selection? Did you make the selection, or did you get any help with the selection?
Yes, no, I did it all that myself. The one bit of advice I got, which was absolutely critical, was from my agent, actually, from a man called Toby Mundy, who used to be the head of Atlantic Books, who's my book agent. And we talked about whether to do what Boris Johnson had actually done with his book of columns, which was just to take all the columns and put them in order, just picking out the best ones, or whether to curate them. And he was very clear that I ought to curate them, and that was the critical decision of the book. The selection then had to be done on two grounds. One is there had to be columns that I liked and I thought people would enjoy reading, and sometimes reading again if they'd read them already in the Times. But they also had to be ones that had a bit of longevity. So some of the columns that I wrote, I think of a column I once wrote about gay rights, and it concerned Ruth Kelly, who was at the time Education Secretary, and her membership of Opus Dei. Now, my view is that most people won't even remember Ruth Kelly, let alone the fact that she was a member of Opus Dei. And so if they read that now, however good the column may have been at the time, it wouldn't make much sense. So I had these three things. First of all, they had to fit into some sort of scheme. I tried to make the book have a degree of coherence so it could be read through as a proper book. Secondly, I wanted to make sure that they were good columns. But thirdly, they had to be ones that still made sense reading them now, because some of these, were written in 2003, say, was the earliest column in this book. I still think that stands up pretty well, and you wouldn't be able to know that it was written a long time ago. But there are some other columns I wrote around that time that simply wouldn't have survived.
You write about politics. You also have a whimsical column in the Times, but also you analyse football with the think tank. How did you develop that expertise?
Well, it's interesting. So I've always thought in a mathematical way. My father was a measurement professor. My mother was a maths teacher. And literally round the Shabbat table, we would have these discussions. How many cans of a certain volume would you be able to fit into a fridge of certain dimensions? Or my parents were very exercised about the fact that centimeters weren't a proper SI measurement. So we would have all these conversations about maths. And while I wasn't a maths specialist, I've always had that way of thinking. And so I approach most things like that, and I approach football like that. But actually, those columns aren't, the direct football columns aren't really in this book. What is, though, is the influence that had, and there are even some references in the book to football as a result of that, which is that it's made me think in statistical terms. It makes me think about series of events, for example, or about basic statistical ideas like regression to the mean, which is this idea that if something goes much bigger than average in one year, it'll come in under the average and go closer to the average the next year. So that kind of thinking, which I was really brought up with, led me to write about football for the Times. But it's also to be found in these columns here, which are not really so much football.
I'm sure most members know, but who do you actually support?
Yes, I do. I don't have it on my kippah, but I'm a Chelsea fan, I'm afraid, which I know divides people. I've never been one of those people who thinks that it's some sort of mark of character. We have some magnificent people from all sorts of football backgrounds. But I was taken by my friend when my father wasn't interested in football at all. His hobby was the study of the progressive rabbinate of 19th century Warsaw. So he wasn't interested in football. But I was taken by a friend's dad who had a season ticket, and I've been in love with it ever since.
Wow. You ran for Parliament yourself. You've been involved with political writing for as long as anyone can remember. How much more difficult do you think are shul politics than national politics?
Well, it's very interesting. So one of the things that really influenced my outlook, and it's very early in the book, is my parents' view that you should try to do everything in proportion. And one of the things that led them to do was to understand the difference between the major catastrophic events that they'd been involved in and the day-to-day experience of living in a suburban community. And so they were extremely keen, for example, never to fall out with other members of the shul. They were members of Hendon Reform Synagogue, and never to get themselves into a situation where they got so embroiled in synagogue arguments that they forgot the purpose of a synagogue, which is to bring people together. But I'm pleased to say, look, any organization will have its differences of opinion, but partly because I think Rabbi Aaron and Rabbi Leah are very skilled leaders, and partly just because of the nature of our membership, NPLS is very much free of that sort of row. It's never completely absent, but it's mercifully free of that. So I think that's one of the reasons it's been a joy to be a member of.
Your father was a staunch Labour supporter and eventually joined the SDP before moving on to the Conservative Party. What do you think he would have made of the Corbyn-led Labour Party had he been alive today?
So I know about that. I mean, he first of all, he wasn't staunch really, because he always had this experience in his past of having been exiled to Siberia, of his father having been sentenced to 8 years for crimes against socialism, of having kind of cooked himself a porridge on by burning a copy of the history of the Soviet Union in Kazakh. He was never going to be a staunch socialist of any kind, and he wasn't even that much of a party person. But he did have a lot of sympathy. And frankly, so do I, with the progressive spirit of the centre left, and he was very respectful of reformist ideas, and that's one of the reasons why he liked Harold Wilson and his planning ideas. He liked all that, but he was very worried always about the revolutionary left. And although Corbyn isn't a Stalinist, I always say he comes at the opposite end of the ice pick from that. He was a socialist of a kind that my father, I think, would have found very difficult, and wouldn't have been surprised that it became associated with socialism, with anti-Semitism.
As a Jew and a Briton, how would you have felt if Corbyn had become Prime Minister?
It was something that I very much was against. I thought that Jeremy Corbyn's broader politics, this kind of anti-imperialist Marxism, was quite attached actually to anti-Semitism. It was very difficult to pull it apart. So I was quite fearful of it. I think, again, one has to get a distance proportion. I don't think it would have led me to leave the country. Some people felt that way. I don't think I did. And it's in the book, actually, an essay on that topic. But on the other hand, it was something that worried me. And I've got some serious doubts about this Conservative government, but my concern about Jeremy Corbyn certainly overbore those. Though I didn't have a difficulty, even despite Brexit and despite my concerns about no deal Brexit, I didn't have a difficulty picking at the last general election.
And final question before we go into more important matters of the shul. Do you think Jewry, and more particularly Israel, receive fair coverage in the British media?
Look, the truth is that a lot of the coverage of Israel is bedeviled, I think, by a bit of a misunderstanding. They do what I call starting in the middle of the story. So, in order to understand why Israel takes protective security actions, you have to start with this question. should a state of Israel exists? And when you do that, that's what I always try and start off with my writing. When you do that, then you begin to build a case for why it needs to do certain things to protect itself. And it's different, I think, then. Whereas sometimes the BBC starts in the middle and all you get is the Israeli government responding to an attack without necessarily learning what the attack was or why the Israeli government felt it had to respond to it. So, yeah, I think some of that coverage lacks context. And I understand why Jewish people are, feel threatened by it and feel cross that their case is not made. But it is also true that whenever you feel partisan about something, one is inclined to think the coverage of it is biased. So I do a little bit adjust for that. And I also think one has to be very careful not to think everything the government of Israel does is bound to be correct. So if someone's covering it in an unfavorable way, it's biased coverage. We've had that on the Times where we covered the use of phosphorus gas, for example, and a lot of people wrote to me denying that it could possibly have taken place and saying that this was an example of biased coverage. Well, that wasn't right, so I think we do have to be particularly careful about that. So yes, the answer to your question is I do sometimes feel that, but I also do check my feelings sometimes.
Danny, you, your wife, Nikki, and your sons are members of the shul. Why liberal Judaism? What's the attraction?
Well, look, so first of all, philosophically, I am progressive. That is to say, I believe that we human beings learn and progress as we learn. And one of my reasons for supporting, for example, a capitalist economy is that it allows progress, scientific progress on learning, and we change as we learn. So I wouldn't want to feel as though we'd prayed for thousands of years and learned nothing. Just to give an example of that, gay rights, for example, is an example of that. I believe that we learn more and more about what the scriptures mean and about what spirituality means, about what belief in God means, and so that's where I start philosophically, and that could lead me either into the reform or liberal tradition. Our choice of NPLS was originally was a pragmatic one, which was there were a lot of children there. We had at that point 2, but later 3 young boys. We wanted to be part of a synagogue that had a lot of other young families, and this synagogue did. But when we went round, first Rabbi Andrew and then Rabbi Aaron were just very impressive figures to us, and that made us part of a synagogue in an engaged way. I think beyond probably what either Nikki or I had expected to happen. I've always been very committed to my Judaism, but I think that I found NPLS a very congenial home, and I don't worry that my sort of strongest moral convictions and my religious heritage will clash. They should support each other, and that's what they do in a liberal synagogue. And I feel otherwise, for instance, I would find it very difficult to be part of a community in which regularly I would find that Nikki would have to sit, upstairs while I sat downstairs. That just wouldn't suit me. I'm very respectful of of people who are from other parts of the community. There are so few of us. We all have to stick together and show each other respect, affection, and regard. So I have a great regard for people like Rabbi Sachs or Rabbi Mervis, and for people whose practices are very different to mine. But NPLS makes me comfortable.
It's a good advert for the shul. Now, your younger son Isaac was bar mitzvah earlier this year. It was the first Zoom bar mitzvah during lockdown, and we actually, I believe, have a clip for those who may have missed it.
Adonai, Mekadesh Shabbat.
Amen.
Shekoyach, Isaac, that is absolutely incredible. And I'm just wondering, Isaac, as your brothers come in as well for the blessings, would you pass the yud back to Rabbi Leah? Pass it back, Isaac.
Other direction. No. Thank you for the yard, Isaac. Fabulous.
And not to be left out, your two other sons actually recorded Who by Fire for the Rosh Hashanah service, and we've got a clip of that too.
And who by fire, who by water, who in the sunshine, who in the nighttime, who by high ordeal, who by common trial, who in your merry month of May, who by very slow decay, and who shall I say is calling? And who in her lonely slip, who by barbiturates, who in these realms of love, who by something blunt, and who by avalanche, who by powder, who for his greed, who for his hunger, and who shall I say is calling? Braver sense, who by accent, who in solitude, who in this mirror, who by his lady's command, who by his own hand, who in mortal chains, who in power, and who shall I say is calling?
Wow, I think you're allowed to quell a bit out over that, as they say. Now, your eldest son has just gone to university. How worrying a time is that for you at the moment, hearing as we do what is going on at universities with COVID at the moment?
Yeah, look, I'm not worried about their health because, frankly, the problem isn't with that age group. I'm much more worried about my own or older than my health and them spreading it to us. So I'm not worried about that. But obviously, I am worried that this, glorious time in his life as university time might be spoilt a bit by this. But as my wife says to me, it's me that's more worried about it than he is. He seems to be fine. So we're all right. And I spoke to him on the phone on Friday night actually, and he'd just lit the candles by himself and was a bit rueful that the Jewish JSOC wasn't meeting because he likes to go to that on a Friday, and so he is missing out on some of these things. But I'm not worried so much. It's a bit disappointing for him.
I think seeing all the joy that this shul can bring to people, what would you say to those detractors from other sections of Judaism, those detractors about liberal Judaism and Reform Judaism?
I think I say two things. The first is, we've all got to live and love each other, right? We all have different perspectives, and there aren't very many Jews, right? We've learned that we have to stick together to some extent, and that our interests are quite similar. We've discovered that during the recent, election campaign when we were all reliant on the voices of each other. So the first thing I would say is that. The second is don't think that there's something that's a compromise in the way that liberal Jews live. This isn't a sort of diluted orthodoxy. It's a different perspective on Judaism, but as rich and as strong and as, in my view, its sort of future prospects are brighter because it allows the prospect of progress, which I think is a very important part of how a religion can continue to thrive. The most important thing is I don't expect anybody who doesn't share that perspective, who finds liberal Judaism, alien to their tradition, to their family tradition. I don't expect those people to celebrate in the way that I celebrate, but I do hope that they can be persuaded to see us all as part of a brethren, a brethren and sorority.
Thank you, Danny Finkelstein, and reminder to everybody that Everything in Moderation by him, published by William Collins, is out now.
Thank you.